So recently, I was on a plane flying back to Denver, flying back to DIA. And on this particular flight, I sat next to a lady, and she began sharing some of her story with me. And for the next 2 hours, I heard all about her relationship with her grandma. Now, she considers her grandma her absolute best friend in the entire world. And she says that from the age of from when she was a young girl, age of 5, her parents weren't around, and so her grandma raised her. And she said, since life and my career and everything, I just haven't been back to see my grandma in a few years, but we still talk twice a week on the phone, every single week. But she said, today, I'm going back home to see my grandma, because she recently received some bad news regarding her health, and doctors aren't giving her long to live. And I said, wow, so this is a big trip for you, huh? I said, do you have plans? And she says, oh yeah, we've got plans. My grandma, she's the fun one. Like when we get together, we have fun together. And I said, so what are y'all going to do? She said, well, when she picks me up from the airport tonight, we're driving straight up to the mountains because tomorrow we're going skiing. And I'm looking at her, and I'm just making some general observations here. She appears to be somewhere around my age, maybe late 20s, early 30s. And so I'm doing some math in my head, and I'm thinking, that means your grandma is somewhere at least in her 70s, maybe even the 80s. And I look at her, and I say, your grandma skis? She said, oh yeah, and she's really good too. And I talked to her this morning, and she doesn't know yet whether or not she's going to ski tomorrow, but we're still going up together. And so the flight lands, and we get off the plane, and we each go our separate ways. But you know how at DIA, you got to get on the escalator that goes down, and you got to get on a train to the baggage claim area and the passenger pickup and where your car might be. And so I go down the escalator, I get on a train, and she happens to be on the same card I am. And so we get off the train together, and you got to go back up the escalator. And so we get on the escalator, and she's right in front of me. And we get halfway up the escalator, and she turns around and she looks at me. And her eyes are all welled up with tears, but they're not falling yet. And she cracks a little smile, and she says, with a bit of embarrassment but a lot of pride, she points up to the crowd, and she says, my grandma's the one with the sign. And I look up to this crowd, and I see this little old lady with white hair, kind of fragile looking, and she's holding this sign, and it says, welcome home, so-and-so, her name, and at the bottom of the sign, it says, let's have some fun. And we get towards the top of the escalator, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, I get to watch this thing happen. I get to watch it unfold. And we get off the escalator, and she starts walking really quickly to her grandma. And when she gets to her grandma, she drops her bag, and she gives this huge hug. But it wasn't that kind of good to see you, grandma kind of hug. It was like this long, sweet embracing, because this moment is significant. And a piece of me in this moment wanted to shout out to everyone around me, y'all got to stop right now and watch what's happening here. This is important. This is significant. This is the good stuff in life. But who wants to be that kind of weird, creepy guy? So I didn't say anything. I just keep watching by myself. And the truth is, even if I said something, they wouldn't have gotten it, right? Because they weren't holding the story. But I sat next to her on the plane. I was holding this story, and this was holy, sacred stuff. Everyone you encounter has a story. And there's always more going on just beneath the surface. And so as we look at this parable this morning, I want to encourage you to bear those two things in mind. Everyone has a story, and there's always more happening just below the surface. Luke chapter 18, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Here's how the parable goes. Jesus told this parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous and who looked on everyone else with disgust. 2 people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself with these words: God, I thank you that I'm not like everyone else, crooks, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even lift his eyes to look toward heaven. Rather, he struck his chest and said, God, show mercy to me, a sinner. I tell you, this person went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Seems like a pretty simple, straightforward parable to me, doesn't it? I mean, don't be like the Pharisee, the one who's filled with pride and self-righteousness and arrogance. Nah, be like the tax collector, the one who understands his own status, the one who understands God's status, the one who can keep things in perspective. And it's almost like, when we read this parable, it's almost like it's begging us to take sides, isn't it? But see, the moment we take a side in this parable, we miss what the parable is actually doing. You see, if we just stay on the surface, this parable is a huge trap. Because we, the hearers, we're supposed to get sucked in to judging the Pharisee, seeing him with contempt. Oh, at least I'm not like him. At least I'm way better than you. But here's the thing. Whenever a parable seems to be this simple, this straightforward, this clear, perhaps we're missing something. And see, we have to keep in mind, Luke, when it comes to Luke's gospel, Luke is masterful at reversals. Luke is masterful at turning things upside down. Do you remember the beginning of his gospel? Mary, the mother of Jesus, finds out she's pregnant, carrying the Christ child. What does Luke have Mary doing? Remember, she busts into song, and she starts proclaiming this God who brings down the powerful and who lifts up the lowly. And we're like, Mary, come on, man. That's not how the gods work. The gods reward those who are on top, punish those who are at the bottom. It's a system of reward and punishment. And then do you remember the end of Luke's gospel? Chapter 23, verse 43, when Jesus is hanging on a cross and he utters those most surprising, stunning words to a criminal who's hanging next to him. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. What? I mean, come on, Jesus. This isn't what criminals deserve. They deserve punishment, not paradise. Maybe you've confused the two. So when it comes to these two characters in Luke's gospel, in this parable, we have to take a deeper, closer look because there's more happening just below the surface. Tax collectors first. Because when we approach this parable, most of us generally side with the tax collector. We always have sympathy for the tax collector, but never the Pharisee. But see, the thing is, this is exactly the opposite stance that this first century Jewish audience would have had when they heard the parable. Because for these first century Jews, they saw tax collectors as agents of Rome, not agents of God. Tax collectors, they were the traitors. They were the ones who gave up their people to jump in bed with the Roman Empire. They were the ones who were always described as thieves and rogues, always taking advantage of the people, always doing what's best for them, but never the people. You see, so when it comes to these first century Jews, the ones in the audience hearing the parable, and for these Pharisees, yeah, of course there's going to be a bit of disdain and disgust for the tax collectors. But what's the big surprise in the parable? If parables are meant to surprise, what's the surprise? It comes early in the parable. Verse 10. 2 people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a a tax collector. And if you're hearing this parable, you've got some questions for Jesus. What? A tax collector in the temple praying? This is a pretty unsettling image that Jesus gives us. And what about those Pharisees? Man, we love to judge those Pharisees, don't we? We're quick to judge them, label them. Oh, they're the hypocrites. They're the prideful. They're the self-righteous. And it's when we come to this parable, it's almost like we've been culturally trained to side with the tax collector rather than the Pharisee. But remember, the moment we take sides in this parable, we miss what the parable is doing. And for the majority of these first century Jews in the audience, for the majority of them, they would have seen Pharisees as respected leaders, respected teachers, devoted to their tradition, devoted to the way of God. They would have been ones to walk the walk and talk the talk. Josephus was a first century historian who didn't always side with the Pharisees, but even he described them as the ones who kept the teachings and the doctrine relevant in their society. And how did they do this? Through debate and argument. They would debate and argue these laws, these teachings, these doctrine, and it's the very thing that kept the tradition moving forward. Many scholars suggest that when everything was falling apart, it was the Pharisees who helped hold things together. Remember in 70 AD, when the Romans came in and ransacked the city and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, it was those among the Pharisaic movement, the scribes and others, who got together to compose the rabbinic literature, one of the things that held everything together while everything around them was falling apart. And you might be saying, geez, Ryan, it just sounds like you're just a Pharisee lover. What's going on here? Well, not really. I mean, they have their flaws. They've got their problems. But if we're honest, we haven't given them a fair shake in our culture. And again, what's the surprise in this parable? Neither the Pharisee nor the tax collector behave in such a way that would have been expected by this first century Jewish audience. A Pharisee being dismissive of others in the community? No, that's not how Pharisees behave. A tax collector in a temple, the temple, praying, even showing a bit of repentance? No, that's not how tax collectors behave. And see, we have to be careful that when we read that the tax collector was justified, that we're not also reading, therefore, the Pharisee wasn't justified. Because again, for this first century Jewish audience, of course the Pharisee was already justified. The surprise here is that a tax collector could be justified by such a God. You see, the parable is completely turning things upside down. And once we judge one better than the other, we become trapped in the parable. And see, this parable, it hinges on a setting. Where are the two people praying? In the temple. The temple is the place where the Pharisee and the tax collector are welcome. The temple is a place of prayer. It is a holy, sacred place. The temple is the place where they encounter God, and the temple is the place where Jewish distinction could be proclaimed over and against Roman insistence on assimilation. If you want to survive, you've got to be like us. I mean, are we hearing this parable? Two people going into the temple to offer prayers. Two people with radically different views of the world and radically different views of God. Two people with radically different lifestyles. And it's 2017. What do we do with this parable? Here's what I know. Everyone has a story, and there's always more going on just beneath the surface. And is it possible for our stories to become the temple. In a culture of divisiveness, in a culture where we are so quick to divide and label, is it possible for our stories to become that holy, sacred place where we encounter God's saving grace? Because, see, the truth is, when I start clinging to things like fear, when I start clinging to my impulse to divide and label people, oh, they're this way, they're that way, I know them, I know how they are. This parable comes along and it says, man, you better stay humble. You better stay humble. It reminds me that they have a story and that there's always more happening just below the surface. Am I willing to go there? Fear of refugees coming into our country. Am I willing to hear their stories? Or is it just easier to take a side? Fear of Muslims becoming our neighbors. Am I willing to hear their stories? Or is it just easier to take a side? Immigrants, documented and undocumented. Am I willing to hear their stories? Or is it just easier to take a side? Black Lives Matter. And when that thing in my bones rises up and says, man, what are they always complaining about? Why can't they just suck it up and get their stuff together? Am I willing to hear their stories? And not just hear stories about them, but hear stories from them and with them. Am I willing to go beneath the surface? Or is it just easier to take a side? Man, it gets hard, doesn't it? I mean, this is where the gospel of Jesus Christ gets kind of hard. And see, most of you know that I was born and raised, I come out of the evangelical Christian tradition. And there's a reason I'm not part of it anymore. I, in college, at some point, just began to see things differently. And you know, I'd be lying to you if I said that I never approached that situation with pride and arrogance and that kind of attitude that says, I'm better than you. And let's just call that what it is. It's sinful. And you know, as one of my mainline Christian friends writes, she says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like those evangelicals who neither accept the gays nor see the aesthetic abomination of praise bands. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like that political party who neither recycles nor cares for the poor. And she goes on to confess, while I may not do this prayer, I certainly do so in snide conversations. And you see, when it comes to my evangelical brothers and sisters, am I willing to hear their stories, to go beneath the surface, or is it just easier to take a side? Because you see, when someone is pointing up to the crowd, saying the one with the sign, that's my grandma, you get to hold this story. You actually get to hold a piece of this story. And if you've done this, you know that it's holy, sacred work. You get to hold it. And see, when it comes to Pharisees and tax collectors, Jesus gives us a pretty good example of what it looks like to move forward. Because throughout the Gospels, Jesus continues to recline with the tax collectors and debate with the Pharisees. It's the thing that moves the tradition forward. In other words, Jesus refuses to stop talking with both parties. What have we become if we can no longer talk to each other? What have we become if we can no longer see the humanity in one another? Everyone you encounter has a story. And there's always more going on just below the surface. Amen.